So the smart city conversation is inherently cross-disciplinary. The topic touches on basically every hot button issue related to technology, both in practice and in theory. It's surveillance capitalism, it's the future of democracy, it's AI power, neoliberalism, climate change, inequality, transformation of work, and so on. Um, and in the US, and from what I can gather in Canada as well, there's also the issue of federal and state preemption or provincial preemption here of local authority. Even within the law, the thinking about smart city norms is very interdisciplinary. It essentially involves human rights, criminal justice, development and project financing, local government law, IP law, tech policy, which is my discipline, and environmental law. And then, of course, outside of the law, we've got geographers and economists and urbanists, computer science, STS, humanities, I'm sure, although I'm less familiar with that. And because smart city implementations so clearly intersect with concerns on the ground, civil society groups and active citizens are constantly feeding back into the theory about the interplay between data and urban life. One of the reasons the topic is so cross-disciplinary is that the smart city concept is itself so elastic. It can mean anything, and people who study this area, I have to say, are utterly obsessed with the definition of smart city. So the definition sections of papers on smart cities, they're not just a couple sentences or even a paragraph, but they're often a page or two. And I think one of the reasons is because there's a certain shame some scholars feel about the term smart cities. And I think that's because its origin, like the term big data, it started life as a marketing term. IBM trademarked smarter cities. It couldn't get smart cities, but it trademarked smarter cities, and it has a whole suite of smart services. I'm not ashamed. I think it's a useful term, although I acknowledge that it's semiotic agility. Most definitions, and here I'm just giving you two, include two basic components: that there is a deployment of information technology to improve some function of the city. It's usually about optimizing for efficiency with a minor in sustainability. The ITU definition on the left is probably more typical, and it's certainly, among the earlier ones. It focuses on public deployment with the city itself as the subject. So the smart city is the city doing things to make itself and life in the city smart. Evgeny Morozov and Francesca Bria have a new paper out, and they refer to the city as the object. Some deployments may be core governmental functions, as in criminal justice, or they may be private services, as in Uber. So they are encompassing these private deployments as smart city deployments. And I prefer their definition because one of the hallmarks of smart city deployments is that they integrate public and private technologies. And so Uber, for example, becomes part of the public transport solution through data integration or a data portal. And also the Uber data becomes, if the city can get its hands on it, becomes part of city transport planning. So like I said, the origin of smarter cities is in the private sector, and so you started with sort of in the early 2000s is when the early 2010s is when we started hearing about investments of particularly companies Cisco, IBM, and Microsoft in big tech infrastructure companies, and the ones that made the most splash were sort of the greenfield projects like Sangdo in South Korea, and that's why Sidewalk Labs here in Toronto is making so much waves, because it's unusual, certainly in the West, more common in the global South and in Asia, to have absolutely new cities that are these smart city constructions. So this Cisco Kinetic for cities is sort of Cisco's platform product for cities, and I'll summarize kind of what they say here because it's hard to read. Cisco's former chief globalization officer, they had such a thing, Casper Hertzberg, wrote a book, 2017, about Cisco's experience in getting Sangdo off the ground. They eventually pulled out of that project, and it's interesting the reasons why. There was some resistance to the sort of totalizing concept that they had in mind. And so, if you're interested in the view from Cisco's perspective, that's worth looking at. It's called Smart Cities, Digital Nations. Kinetic for Cities used to be called the Smart and Connected Digital Platform. And what it really is an API for the city. So what they describe on the left is a vignette of a woman going for an early morning run. She gets up, she laces up, she checks her smartphone. It tells her whether she has to be worried about air quality. As she moves through the city, the smart street lights come on for her. She feels safe, it says, crossing through a dark park because of video surveillance that's analyzing behavior. Implicitly, it doesn't say this, but so why would she feel safe? Because there's either deterrence going on or there's intervention happening. On her route, she sees trucks tracing weird patterns to pick up trash only where needed, saving time and presumably saving fuel and street capacity. Then on the right, we have what Cisco describes as the benefits. So first it says, capturing and transforming disparate data insights. So this is about collection, aggregation, and use of data. Second point, it's selling. This is a product that it's trying to sell cities. It also has a private product, also called Kinetic. Customize and grow based on unique goals with inclusion of new solutions. So that is sort of Cisco speak for a platform on which city and third parties can build new apps, sort of making the platform both more useful and more sticky. Learn from the city data. So there's your AI, right? They're talking about machine learning from this massive amounts of data that's collected. And then, I think most strikingly and sort of, unabashed at the very bottom, it says cash in on the value of data with an urban service marketplace. Okay, so this is, I think what Jason Jackson was talking about, this is the collapse of the state and the marketplace sort of visions of what the city is here to do. So the state is going to, in this case, the city, facilitate the market, the monetization of data, the datafication of life. And the smart city discourse is, and the open data discourse, I should say, which sort of is larger and preceded the smart city discourse, is a lot about this. It's a lot about sort of spinning public data, city data into gold and creating these marketplaces for innovation. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this gives you a sense of kind of the range of smart city applications. And, the Sidewalk proposal for Portland kind of covers all of these. Most smart city implementations will be incremental and will be one or two of these in phases. Some of these are really just intensifications of 20th century urban governance innovations. They are actuarial, data-driven decision-making. They involve P3s, public-private partnerships, predictive policing algorithms, which have come up a lot in this workshop, have garnered a lot of attention. In some sense, they're pretty mild smart city interventions because they're really different by degree, but not in kind, from the kind of actuarial predictive policing that's been going on at least since the mid-90s with the CompStat system in New York City. They can become different when there's no human in the loop and they're sort of more fully automated. But I think other kinds of smart city implementations present very new conceptual challenges. For example, many smart city applications rely on sensors and ubiquitous sensors, whether that's for waste. So Sidewalk Labs is proposing sensors at the point of disposal, where in your household, where you put your trash, as well as in the public realm on bins. For health applications, these sensors in the waste stream can help identify disease and drug use hotspots. So obviously, there are some public health benefits to that. There are a lot of privacy concerns. So this is a degree of surveillance, of ubiquitous and sort of penetrating surveillance that really is a difference in kind from what cities have had in the past. Then there is, what's also different is the data integration and the use of big data. Cities have always had a ton of data, and one of the pitches to cities, the smart city pitch, is put your data to use, become a platform for innovation. This is the cash-in pitch. So they've always had a lot of data, but what smart cities require is a kind of data integration that cities have been very poor at doing. So if you think about a patient management system, which is part of the Sidewalk Labs proposal and is common in smart cities conceptions, it's got to use, or it might use, social media data, wearable data, educational data, et cetera, to structure choices and to manage care. And by the way, in ways that cannot be explained. And I think I should have said at the beginning that many of us who do tech criticism often fall into, I think, a pitfall of being very dystopic. It's sort of as a way to prove our critical bona fides. And I myself do this a lot, and so I should caveat, there is a ton of good that these technologies can do. And I'll just give one example. When we talk about sentencing algorithms, we who talk about this tend to be very down on them and focus on the potential fairness pitfalls, from a progressive perspective, but there is a huge progressive win that sentencing I should say not sentencing, pretrial risk algorithms. They have allowed jurisdictions to get rid of cash bail. So in the state that I work in, New Jersey, there's no longer cash bail, which of all the unfair parts of our criminal justice system, they are a big one. And so, I just put that out there. So now I'll go back to being negative. No, before I do that, one positive example. So, there's this specter of Big Brother, unexplainable, integrated data managing our healthcare. And I know, especially in Canada, where you've got good healthcare, that's been a sore spot in the. That has been seen as a real overreach for Sidewalk Labs. In Los Angeles, they are integrating homelessness data, census information, trauma data, eviction data, rent burden data, and data about economic stagnation. I don't even know what that data is, in order to target their interventions on homelessness, right? So I don't know how it's working out, but this is, sort of a promising application. Okay, and then, one last thing I'll just, pull out of here as a kind of highlight about how this is different is, of course, many of these smart city applications are made possible by the Internet of Things that have actuators in them. So in Anton's parlance, there is no doubt that these are agents, right? They are definitely acting. Their behavior will adjust automatically, whether we're talking about AVs, obviously, or, even park benches or water supply. They will perform a kind of automated governance, either perhaps, responsively to immediate inputs, like you've already sat on this bench for too long, it's now time for somebody else, we're closing up the bench for you. I'm not making that up, that's something that's being considered. Or as a matter of anticipatory governance, sort of making predictions about behaviors that it should respond to. Okay, so this comes from McKinsey, which is based on a study of 50 cities. And I know you can't really read that, but this is kind of its distribution, where it thinks cities are on the smart city spectrum. And I think Toronto is right smack in the middle. And then you've got Abu Dhabi and Singapore way out in the advanced category. And you know what it's capturing is that there's a certain amount of basic infrastructure that you need to implement these systems, and the infrastructure you've got to have be able to generate and capture all of this data. You've got to be able to analyze these enormous volumes of data in complex systems. You've got to have smartphone penetration. So that's why India is although it has huge ambitions in the smart city domain, it's why it's behind. You have to have robust communications networks, and so we're talking broadband and low power wide area networks for the Internet of Things, and this is why 5G is so critical. And you've got to be able to convert data into standardized, shareable formats, which, if you know anything about city governance, is a huge challenge. I mean, cities, are still using paper; they're using PDFs, and so that's sort of the basic infrastructure that's necessary. So I think, but what this scatter graph does not capture, which I think is really interesting, and I think it ties into what Jason was talking about sort of the moral embeddedness of AI, is that cities have really different views of the moral valence of smart cities. And so, just to give you an anecdote about this, I was at the Smart City Expo in Barcelona in November of last year, and it was very striking. There were two really different kinds of attitudes and displays. So you could go into China and Huawei were hugely represented, Dubai, Russia, and you go into their pavilions, and they're absolutely celebratory. They're giddy. And they show you the central control room, and they show you the social score, and they show you the analysis of facial expressions, and it's a real sort of God's eye view on the city and how they are going to enact control, efficiency, security. And then you go into the Europeans, and by the way, the North Americans, neither Canada nor the US were well represented at the Smart City Expo. Very kind of shoddy little displays. But the Europeans were well represented, and they were, I would almost say self-conscious and shy and conspicuously reassuring about data protection and sort of, very kind of modest goals that were as much about sustainability and equity as they were about security. Okay, so, and I should say this talk is in two parts. This first part is really just sort of surveying the landscape and as well as the kind of ethical norms that we see developing. And then the second part will be my attempt to extract from this some high-level governance principles. It's very difficult to come up with kind of a consensus view on what the ethics should be around smart cities, in part because smarts implicate everything, right? So we're talking really about everything that happens in a place. And I'll just address a couple of these. So, if you really wanted a comprehensive view of the ethics of smart cities, you'd have to consider, well, what are the ethics of public-private partnerships and sort of the neoliberal project in cities? Cities have been stripped down by austerity measures, decades-long project of sort of disempowering cities, and so and at the same time they are facing their biggest challenges, especially with migration and climate change, and the changing nature of work in the economy. So it's not surprising that when technology companies come to them and say that we can solve your problems, whether that's Compass or Palantir or Cisco or Sidewalk or Streetlight or Lyft, it's very seductive. At the same time, cities are trying to compete for global capital and innovation, and the biggest ones, are really in the hunt to be global cities. So this is part of, I think what Anton talked about and what Jason talked about is it's part of a winner-take-all sort of movement, and so cities are part of that too. And so they are very susceptible to language, the language of tech, like sandbox and hacks and demos and disruption. And that sounds both, first of all, they need it. Second of all, it sounds like it will help them to attract the capital and the talent and sort of the admiration of the world. Second point here about privacy and autonomy. We know, everybody knows, I think it's pretty self-evident what the privacy and autonomy issues are, and they're the same ones that we have with information platforms, except that in the city context, they're magnified in part because there really is no exit. This is, where people live, and they and opt out. As hard as it is in the information space, it's even harder in the city space. And the degree to which sensors sort of magnify the intimacy of the data that is collected and the amount of data that is collected, I think make the privacy questions just sort of sharper in a smart city context. The third point, which is the last point I'll address here, is about sort of, the power of the state, which is implicated here in a way that it isn't always when we're talking about information platforms. So because smart city tech interfaces with the police power, and here I'm using it as a legal term of art to mean not just the police, but the power of the city to ensure health and safety. Smart city applications can be about anticipatory regulation, not in a metaphorical sense, but in an actual sense. Actual regulation can be personalized and automatically enforced. And so, when Kyle was talking about AVs and assignment of liability, you could imagine that not going through the courts at all, right? You could imagine just there being a collision and the AI figures out, how to apportion blame or responsibility, and to the extent we're talking about a penalty, it just makes the shift, the payment through your accounts. So this is. This obviously implicates, due process concerns and fairness concerns, and the downside may be a real reduction in freedom, and making also a reduction in the possibilities of course correction or sort of rethinking path dependencies. So I'll leave the rest of these, but I just to prove that they are real. All of these are real issues for cities. And are in play. I just wanted to read you the list of issues being considered by my city, Philadelphia. It's a smart city committee that I'm sitting on, to give you a sense of the scope. Socioeconomic inequality, digital revolution, international upheaval and migration, mobility as a service, workforce automation, transportation technology deployment, climate change, social and political dysfunction, shifting demographics, technocracy, updating infrastructure, low-density divestment. So by this, they mean sort of de-annexing parts of the city where there's low density, which is a trend at least among American cities. Greater Philadelphia and global economy, housing shortage, delivery on demand, end of bricks and mortar retail. Okay, so no smart city code of ethics can deal with all of that. So they're all necessarily partial. So let me just give you a sense of, and there are more than this, but these are some of the leading sort of emerging ethical codes that we've seen. The first efforts focused on the technical systems themselves and identified privacy and security concerns. So Rob Kitchen, who's a geographer at Maynooth University in Ireland, and Lillian Edwards, who's a legal scholar at Strathclyde in Scotland, were early onto this, and they have applied sort of the privacy law scholarship in the smart city context. So it's very much GDPR concepts and fair information practices concepts. And then legal scholars, especially Scott Peppett, emphasized security aspects. So this is about, IoT security and making sure that the city is not, or functions in the city are not hacked. The second wave of smart city ethical codes, and so by second wave, I'm really talking about in the last 2 years, have shifted, I think. They include all the privacy and security stuff, but they've expanded out from that. And also their locus has shifted from purely the academic realm to include cities and sort of communities of practice, activists. And so they are addressing sort of forms of industrial organization. The BAS Declaration, which was 2016, I think, which was adopted at the European Conference on Sustainable Cities, is focused on sustainability. But in its declaration, it addressed technological transformation and in this regard, urged cities to address the digital divide, support open data and access to data. And then sharing cities, which is, can't quite figure out what it is. It's EU funded, it includes cities, but also industry and civil society groups, and it's chaired by the City of London. So you tell me what that is. But anyway, they address, they do have some really interesting ideas, and they sort of are focusing on the top layer, on the models that are built on top of the city as a platform. And really, I think interestingly proposes to kind of revive a collaborative model so that cities are not beholden to Airbnb and Uber, but instead, begin to nurture sort of peer-to-peer exchanges. Okay, so that's what we see out there so far. Now, I'll give you some of my ideas. How can we begin to produce a normative mapping for smart cities that is sufficiently inclusive, but has some definition, doesn't cover all of these domains? And so my first attempt at this was to think about data as infrastructure, and that's probably because I come from a telecom law background. And so if data is infrastructure, it's then natural to think of that infrastructure using a layered model like we do for the internet. And with apologies to Jason and other computer scientists, we in law use a very simplified model. But I think it pretty much, it has some of that same DNA. So we've got kind of physical hardware at the bottom, and then we've got logical systems, and then we've got applications at the top. This is, Sidewalk Labs is thinking along the same lines. So this is, you'll be familiar with this from the beautiful, beautiful graphics that Sidewalk Labs has prepared for its proposal at Quayside in Toronto. So what it's got is, it's got this bottom layer, which is kind of itself 4 layers, where it's got physical infrastructure, and then it's kind of got the built environment on top of that. It's divided it into public realm, which is parks and streets and curbside, and then the buildings on top of that with kind of mobility circulating in there. But then, the innovative concept for Sidewalk Labs is that you've got this digital layer, and the digital layer sort of sits above everything, but it also interpenetrates through with its sensors, with its API, with its portal, with cloud, with the data analytics. Okay, I think I want to go back here. Yeah. So if you if you focus on data flows, or really the digital layer here as being the kind of central smart city infrastructure, if that's the principal object of your ethical concern, then you will focus on data governance as your intervention. And I think what we've seen so far with the Sidewalk Labs project is that this is where it's gone, right? It's that if you're concerned about the digital layer, really what you're concerned about are data flows, so we'll fix that, right? And so Sidewalk Labs has proposed this civic data trust, which I won't go into the details, but it's a way to kind of manage data. And I think the danger of that is that it's built on an assumption that the data gathering is going to happen, and that the system is going to be based on indiscriminate, ubiquitous, and redundant data gathering. And so really what we need to work on is this second part, is this data governance about who gets access to it and how is privacy protected. And we never really question kind of what's the bigger picture and what are the bigger dynamics, the winners and losers, and the vision for life in the city. I think maybe, let's see, what time is it? Well, I guess we do have time. I'll say just a couple of things about data governance. On data gathering, I think we need sort of new governance regimes, and this is not part of the really covered by the civic trust that Sidewalk Labs has proposed, that acknowledge that notice and choice don't work in the smart city context. How can renters consent to surveillance through their Nest that they didn't install? How can anyone consent to surveillance through trash chutes where censoring is required in order to get trash service? For that matter, how can homeowners consent? So many of us thought we were resisting Alexa, and then Amazon showed up in our homes anyway when it bought, this happened to me, when it bought the routers Eero, right? So we thought we were free from Alexa, and Amazon's in there now. So consent, I don't think really works, and that is, that still remains the bedrock of our sort of data governance frameworks. I also think we need to figure out how to deal with integrated data. So there's a sense, I think, still that data licensing agreements have that you can kind of claw back data when you can apply use restrictions and then get it back. And it just doesn't work that way once data has been integrated into sort of big data systems. And then finally, on the data deployment point, this is probably what we've talked about most in this workshop, is how do we deal with the black box problem? So to the extent that more and more of our city services and either public or private decisions that are happening in the city are being driven by algorithmic decision making, how can they be rendered accessible through explanation or through other means? How do we deal with bias and with due process? Okay, so like I said, I like the infrastructure analogy. I think we can sort of see that we can have a handle on it, but unfortunately, I don't think it's really capacious enough to deal with these cross-cutting concerns that arise in the smart city context. So my second attempt at this, or my second iteration, is to move up a level from the data flows to some of the other concerns. All right, so let's start with, and these are overlapping. Privatization, domination, and platformization are sort of my three buckets. Let's start, and then they're overlapping, and they still don't cover everything, but I think that's the best I can do so far to kind of be both expansive and challenging, and yet, be useful for theorists, interdisciplinary theorists, and city practitioners themselves. All right, so first of all, let's talk about privatization. It starts with, so the concerns here are that you privatize planning through the smart city project. That's nowhere is that clearer than in the Sidewalk Labs project, where Sidewalk Labs was invited or won an RFP to be an innovation partner. I think they call it, I think Waterfront Toronto calls it a thinking partner. So this is really to design the city, also to conduct procurement, also to be a vendor, also to be a landowner. It doesn't, even in cases where we're not talking about greenfield smart cities, there's a way in which smart city applications invite the private sector into fundamental planning decisions for the city. So Morozov calls this solutionism. Judith used the word uncomfortably, as I do too, problematicization. It's an ugly word. We need to figure out something better than that. But so far, that's the best we have, right? So creating problems that really aren't the city's problems. So there was, I heard a city manager say, you know, a venture fund comes to me and says, we've got a great idea for street furniture in your city. We want to make an automated barista that's going to give you, you know, lattes in 30 seconds so you're not going to have all these lines at the coffee shops. And this city guy said, you know, that's just not a problem that I have. You know, I have other problems. Will you solve those? You know, and unfortunately, those other problems, you know, until there is a venture-funded sort of play for those, they're not attractive. So, so there's a tension about, you know, keeping planning public. Second area of privatization is data and IP. Where does the data live? You know, I think the default arrangements should be that city data should live locally, unless there's some reason not to, unless the city can't secure it. IP is a whole nother kettle of fish, but I'll just say that it's a problem to the private ownership of IP, and cities or the public, you know, maybe having licenses to use that IP, but it being limited, and the specter of sort of losing critical functionality in a city because the IP, whether it's patents or trademarks, patents or copyright, or whether it's just trade secret, is vested in private hands. The same thing is true when you're dealing with algorithmic decision making. You know, there is IP in play there, and so you've got Palantir owning the algorithm for predictive policing, and police communities want to understand, you know, what is the thinking, and the city can't provide it because it doesn't have access to the necessary data or analytics. And by the way, for the law nerds, there's a Supreme Court case right now pending. It's called Food Marketing Institute versus Argus Leader. Oral argument is on April 19th. And this is a case that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it's about freedom of information and exemptions for confidential information. And if the court finds that sort of upholds an expansive reading of what confidential information is, it will have pretty significant implications for the ability of the public to get any kind of explanation out of private algorithms, because it will provide a lot of breathing room for claims that those are trade secrets. Okay. Let's talk about, I'm going to skip this. Oh, yeah, I do want to mention this. I want to go on to regulation and enforcement, but this, you know, another way in which privatization works in the smart city is through the API. So most Sidewalk Labs, for example, talks about an open API. So that sounds like, okay, it's going to be open, we're all going to own it, right? And it doesn't really mean that. It means you can build to it, and you can have third-party apps, but it's kind of like Android, right? So when Google wants to change Android, they can change Android. And so one has to be worried about privately owned APIs in the city. And the reason I just wanted to mention this book by Stephen Goldsmith, who's at Kennedy School, is that, it very much, this book is about a new operating system for the city, and the basic idea is that we need to push decision-making down to line workers, the social worker, the cop, who's got the tablet and has access to all the data that may be necessary to make a decision about, a child protective service or a policing decision. And, it's totally dependent on there being an API and a data portal and sort of integrated data that this decision maker has access to. So there's kind of a synergy between sort of the new, most progressive thinking about how to run cities and what the vendors, and the vendors' business. And so that should make us even more nervous about the prospects for privatization. Okay, so governance and enforcement. I just want to use this one example because it comes from Toronto, and it's pretty fascinating. So what Sidewalk Labs has proposed, their vision for the city, and again, this is also very consonant with kind of the best thinking in city planning, which is mixed use. We know mixed use has been hot for a long time. They want radical mixed use, right? So what radical mixed use looks like is, you see the top little square is, the top square is kind of traditional zoning, right, where you've got uses segregated, and then the bottom square is radical mixed use, where you've got uses can be separated, floor by floor within a building, or even unit by unit within a building. So you can have a welder on a floor next to a residence, next to a school. How does this work? Well, it only works with code and with data. So the idea is that you've got, so in the current system, you have uses are separated to avoid conflicts, and the conflicts are caused by negative externalities: too much noise, too many emissions, too many kids, whatever it is that is an annoyance. And with an outcome-based code system, you have conflicts managed by monitoring and guaranteed enforcement, right? So you can imagine the kind of sensor networks that are required to make this work. So the sensors pick up too much noise, too many emissions, too many pitter-patters of little feet, whatever it is. And then there's guaranteed enforcement, not explained what that means, but that could be fines, right? So the most benign understanding is that that's just going to mean it's your automatic fine. It could mean, possibly, since everything is going to be mediated by an app and the data portal, that you can't get into, that the locks don't work. It's essentially, it's not even constructive eviction. It's automatic eviction. Maybe it's temporary. And so, they then, this comes, by the way, this is, you can't see, but it's taken from Sidewalk Labs' materials. And so when they talk about nuisance, they are suggesting that we can move from a very sort of messy liability system where you have to argue about what a nuisance is, and it's case by case, to a kind of encoded, immediately enforced by fine or other intervention system. Right? So that is. It's an automation of law, of regulation and enforcement, but it's also possibly a privatization, because although they say that of course the code, the standards will be determined publicly, right, by the public authorities, between the public proclamation, there is no public definition of nuisance, right? Nuisance is, the right thing in the wrong place. So you'll have to tell us, Jason. I can imagine your students sitting in a room and saying, tell us what you want us to do, right? Tell us what the standard is. They're going to have to figure out what the standard is. So the vendor, the code maker, is going to have to encode nuisance. Okay, going to the next one. A lot of what I think are the concerns, I am just classifying as fears of domination. And I think there's a systemic aspect to this, and there's the individual aspect to this. The systemic aspect to this is that, beyond, obviously, there's some overlap with the privatization. Beyond the private domination of the public, there is a concern that there will be domination by a particular company or a couple particular companies, that we will replicate in cities what we have in the information space. And for the same reasons, that there are network effects, that there's winner take all. This is the nature of sort of data-based businesses. In the case of Sidewalk Labs, there's real reason to be concerned. It's probably, at the far end of the spectrum in terms of the patient capital that it's willing to throw at this, and the ways in which, because of the way the agreement is structured, the ways in which they will be able to prefer their own companies for procurement of the various pieces of the smart city deployment. So this is, don't need to worry too much about the details here, but you've got, sort of Alphabet has Google, which is responsible for, I think, like 99 or 98% of their revenue. And then they've got all these other, what they call big bets. And so the big bet companies are just patient capital looking for the next business. And Sidewalk Labs is just one of them. Nest is another. Waymo is another. And then all these other companies are spawned or are like little baby sidewalks. So they've got Replica, which is a modeling company. They've got Cord, which is transportation. City Block, which does health. Intersection does marketing, and they're responsible for the Link NYC kiosk. And so if you look at all the Sidewalk Lab documents and presentations, it's clear that all of these companies, they imagine that all these companies will have a piece of this. And so, there is legitimate fear that it won't just be privatized governance, but it will be Google governance. Another aspect of the sort of systemic domination, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, but which is kind of a shadow over all of these smart city deployments, is security. So these were just, two well-publicized hacks. So the Jeep its navigation system was hacked into, it's taken over, run into a ditch. The TrendNet was a baby monitor system, which was hacked, and so very easily had almost no security, and so the hackers could view into the baby's room. So, I view the security risk, the brittleness of these systems, the lack of security in the Internet of Things deployments, as a piece of the concern about sort of systemic domination. I guess just before we leave this, I think on the individual side, a lot of this has to do with privacy. There is the constant surveillance and the chilling function that creates in terms of robust and free and autonomous living. And then there's the choice architecture, which I think Judith may have touched on a little bit about, nudges, so that in a system of sort of ubiquitous sensing and automatic regulation, there is, and in fact, one of the features of these systems is that they can create a pro-social choice architecture, so that your choices about healthcare, your choices about transportation, your choices about what you're throwing away and where to throw it, when you use the water, what your thermostat is set to, all of these choices start to be channeled and constrained in ways that may be obvious and transparent, and in ways that may not be. Okay, so this, the third bucket here is, platformization, another ugly word. And in some ways, I think the hardest to grapple with, the one that requires the most new thinking, the one that is probably newest. So let me go through this by using Sidewalk Labs as my example and its language. What they want to do is create networked neighborhoods, operating at a system scale like the internet, generating advantages that increase with each new node. All right, so we don't even have to probe this too much to just immediately see that this is the internet, right? This is the internet in the city. And so we should assume that the same problems we know exist with internet networks are going to the smart city application of this architecture is going to raise the same questions. So what are the network effects? Is it going to produce a winner-take-all result? Is there space for alternative visions and opt-out, right? So we know how hard that is. Even if you're not a Facebook user, you are subjected, right, to Facebook surveillance. Will the same thing be true in the smart city if there are choices you want to make not to be sensed, not to have wearables, not to be surveilled? Will those be possible? And if they are, will they be meaningful? What is the role of non-commercial institutions? So if you look at the architecture that Sidewalk Labs envisions, and this is not just, this is generally true in smart cities, as it is on the internet, there is a flattening, right? There is, the internet doesn't know if you're a dog. These smart city applications, the platformization doesn't really care who you are in the system. And also whether you're public or private, whether you're non-commercial or commercial, you are all just end users of a system. And so that's a kind of architectural choice that we have to be comfortable with. And I think here, in the same way that we've all learned, that Mark Zuckerberg has had to confess that they are a media company and not just a tech platform, that these are normative choices that are being made, that they are not just neutral affordances. The same thing is true here, right? So this architecture is not neutral. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it means that we better grapple with what it's going to mean. Okay, and so what are its values? Well, so it's the principal value to me that I see emerging from the Sidewalk Labs proposal is flexibility and agility. So you saw that in the radical mixed use building concept. And pay attention, by the way, to how often they use radical. Which I don't know if that's an engineering thing, but okay. It's a little striking from a policy perspective that you should be so free and easy with the use of the term radical. Just in time, right? So just in time, efficient, and that we know from the gig economy. And so what we know from the gig economy is that there are losers. There's this amplification of market rationality. There's a push to datafy everything and to turn everything into an exchange. Flexibility is great. Agility is great. Cities are also in the business of ensuring stability, right? So they have to plan for 25 and 50 years. There's a cost to flexibility, and so in thinking about this architecture with these values, we better be thinking about who's going to pay those costs, who's going to sort of deal with the losers in a gig economy, what provisions are being made and what are the responsibilities of the market participants or the architects or the winners in this sort of these new markets. In other words, when Cisco says cash in, who's cashing in, and does there need to be some sort of redistribution? So in terms of distribution, and specifically the distribution of public realm assets, Sidewalk Labs talks about a programmable public space. Parks can be used for recreation or they can be used for pop-up commerce. Streets can be reconfigured dynamically for bikes or for emergency vehicles, two-way traffic, one-way traffic. So all of this depends on the models. Who's going to model this stuff? What is the data going to be? Sidewalk Labs has a modeling company. They have a company that's doing this. Is it going to be them? Is it going to be a public modeling effort? Is that going to be is there going to be accountability for that modeling? Is there going to be public input into that modeling? What gets counted, right? What are the inputs into this model? What kinds of uses are valued? All right, this is my last slide. Because I'm a law person, I have to come up with some solutions. So here's my effort, or at least it's a gesture towards them. A very imperfect gesture. And this is really intended, as much as anything, because this is so cross-disciplinary and because it's there's so much active conversation between practice and theory. I thought it would be useful to try to create these buckets and then kind of organize possible responses into these buckets or bundles of concern. On privatization, I think the most important step is that it has to be policy forward and not vendor forward. And so there has to be public control over the ways in which these smart city implementations get made, the choices we make, consideration, full ventilation as best we can, given that this is very dynamic, about what architectures we're preferring, what are the values. I think one of the critiques about the Sidewalk Labs process has been that Ontario, Canada, Toronto did not have a smart cities policy really, or really much of a data governance policy before this process started. So it's being drafted kind of arm in arm with Sidewalk Labs. I don't think that's the way to do it. Most cities don't have chief data officers, and many that do don't report to the mayor or the city manager or whoever has clout in the city. So that's really important, is that you don't have these decisions aren't left with the IT guy, right, or even the procurement office, but that they're understood to be central to the democratic functions, the distributional functions, the health and welfare of the people in the city. That obviously requires transparency, and that ultimately will require, real attention to the data and the IP issues. On the domination, in the domination bundle, I think an anti-domination agenda is really about distributing power. Government contracts, especially IT contracts, have been very bad at that, right? So IT contracts, IT vendors are often, just New York City, for example, did this. Microsoft just come in and do all of this for us. And, that wasn't great in the IT domain, but now this is not the IT domain, right? This is everything. This has a sort of totalizing consequence. And so the stakes are much higher, and you really need, I think, vendor heterogeneity to avoid or limit the amassing of data power. So I use this term data power advisedly. This is not a term of art. And I think it's it's getting a lot of attention in antitrust circles about what data power actually is and what it looks like. And so I think, cities need to pay attention to what data power is and try to make sure that in the contracting out of these opportunities, that they're not aggrandizing that power or allowing that power to deprive them of governance. The kind of data governance outlined in the Bass Declaration, I think, plays a role here, but it's not enough. And I think one point I want to make here is that open data policies, which is sort of low-hanging fruit, and I think often kind of masquerades as a solution to power, they're not. Open data is most useful to the companies that can make use of that data and that have the analytic chops and the servers capacity and the cloud capacity and all of that to make use of it. So it can do some good, but it is by no means a solution to the data power problem. I think really the hardest issue, both in domination and in platformization, is opt-out. When data and data analytics are infrastructural, opting out may be like opting out of electricity or asphalt. It's just not something people can do. And so, I think, and frankly, even when you can opt out, there's this problem. It's a great paper by Scott Peppett called Privacy Unraveling, and it applies the economic concept of unraveling to the information privacy context. And so what he points out is that, if you have a comprehensive system of surveillance or even just of signaling, and you choose not to disclose, you will be penalized because you will be understood to have something to hide. And so there is an unraveling to sort of the lowest level of, or the most disclosive level. And the only solution to that are paternalistic solutions, a kind of don't ask, don't tell, or a kind of Fourth Amendment, right against self-incrimination that we will not hold against you, your right to remain silent. That is a systemic decision. That is not an individual decision. And I think we need to think about sort of systemic opt-outs and protections so that people's choices not to participate in some of these smart city innovations will not be held against them. And then finally, I'll say one thing about the platformization, and I think what I'll choose to focus on here, I've already mentioned kind of the importance of non-commercial actors. So in cities, we often call them anchor institutions, libraries, schools, public media. They play a really important function, and I think this is what I like about the Sharing Cities Declaration or Ethics Code, is that they sort of amplify that and revive that notion in the smart city context. So I think we need to take anchor institutions and non-commercial actors sort of seriously and elevate them in this conversation. And I think it's been really interesting in the Sidewalk Labs context that there's been a proposal that the public libraries should be the repository of the data rather than this new civic trust. And then on the externalities point, I'll just use as an example, so you see that part of the language of platformization and the city as platform is this tech language of demoing and testbed urbanism, right? So, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's great to have experiments. Cities call them pilot projects, right? And to move fast and sometimes to break things, right? But breaking things causes externalities. And I don't think cities really have a plan yet to sort of allocate costs and responsibilities for those externalities. And if you want to be a platform, there's got to be some way in a city, you've got to deal with that. So just to use, a relatively trivial example, what happens when the Lime scooters are broken down and left on the sidewalk as litter, right? Is that part of their responsibility to deal with that? Is that the city's responsibility? Platformization, testbed urbanism involves failure, right? So engineers, are comfortable with that. Cities have not really planned for failure and to allocate the cost for that. I'll stop there.